While this approach can be a huge relief, it's no simple change of perspective. It takes practice and effort for sure.
As far as this new relationship we can develop with the thought process, it seems challenging, maybe even impossible to some people to become aware of the thought process. After all, we're so identified with our thoughts. Many of us have a deep belief that we are our thoughts, we are what we think. This is, think about Descartes and his, declaration, I think, therefore I am. I think, in our culture, we believe that to a certain extent. It takes a little doing, it takes a little practice, and it takes a willingness to experiment, but I find that any adult or even reasonably mature child can just take up the practice of backing off from the thought process a little bit rather than following every single thought and wondering what every thought means and interpreting that thought, which leads to more thoughts, which are interpretations, and we all know where that road leads. If we just take a step back a little bit and just notice that there are thoughts there, that there's activity there, that it's moving, that it's flowing, we realize that we're not automatically caught in thought. We realize almost immediately that there's an awareness that can be aware of thinking. And we also notice just how calming it is to be aware of thought as opposed to being thought. Being thought can be like being on a bucking bronco, right? And we're getting tossed all over the place, and that's all we are. We're the bronco, we're this thinking mind. But it's a lot nicer to be in the bullpen behind those cages where the bull is bucking that poor cowboy around and saying like, wow, I'd hate to be that guy right now. And we can take that stance with the thinking process. And what's amazing about it is it doesn't take much. It takes a willingness to just kind of watch your thoughts. And you certainly get better at it over time, practicing it. But there's an incentive built into the process. It feels so good to be able to take a break, take a little vacation from thought, that I find a lot of adults that I talk to about this concept, they're intrinsically motivated to do it because they know just how helpful it is for their mental health, their physical health, sometimes for their sanity.
Although challenging, this approach is totally doable for those willing to practice and learn.
So learning to observe your thoughts without taking them personally and without believing them and without having to act on them is a skill, and it's a very learnable skill.
If I look back on my own kind of practice and process of relating to thought in a different way so that I'm not its slave, but rather its master, I think about just this steady, gradual process of pushing back from thought, kind of watching it, and then getting pulled back in, because we always get pulled into our thoughts, we always get pulled into the drama of our lives. But I would just practice pushing back, the same way you go to a gym and you work dumbbells, and that, back and forth, or up and down, that's training the muscles. I felt like I was training the muscles of awareness by pushing back and getting pulled back in. This force of gravity, you can liken it to, where we're so interested in our thoughts, we're so interested in the content, we're so convinced that the content is what's important, we get pulled back and smack into it. And we might wake up 5 seconds later, 5 minutes later, 5 years later and realize that was just a thought and I've been acting it out, assuming that that was my life and that was the only way. And you realize just how limiting thoughts can be on your perception of who you are and what your life can be.
As you can see, this new relationship to thought is very, very good news. Over time, as individuals practice, they can come to directly experience a new relationship with their own mind. And in this new relationship, rather than being permanent fixtures in our lives, challenging emotions and thoughts have the space to come and go without all the drama.
The broken records that have been playing in your head for however many years, you don't even know where you got half of this information. And it's just playing and running you. And surprisingly, there's an option to actually take a rest from that for a second and to see what's actually happening in your life and just around you right now without that stream of incessant thought. And most human beings, just by virtue of the fact that they want relief from that, when they're given the invitation to do that, even if they can't do it for 45 minutes, even if they can't hold it, they get a glimpse of that, and the honest response is, that feels a lot better. that feels a lot clearer.
This new relationship with our thoughts can almost immediately begin to change our experience of mental and emotional distress.
If you notice where your mind is, if you can pay attention to where your mind is, you might start to get a sense that there's something separate from the thoughts that are arising, and that these negative things that are coming up are just kind of what the mind does, but you don't have to take them so personally, in a sense, and you can kind of view them at a distance, which kind of frees you up to think, okay, the negative thought is not me, it's the thought, and it will pass.
Rather than being the final truth, then, a thought can also just be a thought. And a feeling? Well, that can also just be a feeling, not reality, not the world, not you. I can have depressive thoughts. I can have anxious thoughts. I can have all kinds of emotions, physical sensations, but I'm much more than just that. I'm much more than just that.
You know, you're not your thoughts. You know, you're not those emotions. You know, there's certainly a huge influence on you, but that's not who you really are. That's the piece that offers the hope.
When I work with teens a lot, they can learn that they can, by resting in the still, quiet place, they can observe those thoughts without believing them, without taking them personally, without having to act on them. And that's a very powerful thing, because for most people, not just teenagers, but all of us who have those thoughts in our heads, we think they're true, and we take them at face value, and then we live our lives out of them. And it's like, it's just a thought, and you're much more than your thoughts.
If you have a thought, and if you have a feeling that hit you, it may just be a thought. It may just be a feeling. It may say nothing about you. It may have no significance or meaning. So for my friend who's being hit with thoughts that he is a total failure and not worth even living and not wanting to live, it could be really liberating if he could start to watch those as thoughts.
In other words, while the emotions and thoughts coming up may reflect on something useful, something productive, something healing, they may not. In fact, some thoughts or feelings may not tell us anything useful about our lives at all. That's up to us to decide, but it sure is nice to have a choice.
I would just learn to push back a little bit and start to just observe the flow of thought, the movement of thought. And as I did so, I realized that there was awareness that was deeper than the thought process itself. And again, that was probably one of the most shocking discoveries I ever made, to really connect with that firsthand, this experience of seeing my thought process. As I observed it, I would become aware of awareness itself. And that gave me a great deal of freedom. What was previously experienced as this kind of torture, this being enslaved by the thought process, I was able to push back from that and just notice it as something a lot more innocuous, kind of like lying down on the bank of a river, just watching the stream float by.
It's that fundamental capacity to be mindfully aware of what we're experiencing, to take the bird's eye view, to observe it, to perceive it, to get off the movie, as it were, of our upset and our reactions to things, and pop back 20 rows, eating popcorn, looking at the screen, going, wow, what a bummer, how hard for that person. I don't mean this sarcastically, I mean it in a very genuine way, a sympathetic way, but with some disengagement. That this is an experience that arises due to causes, it will pass away due to causes, and it's not our identity. We're not necessarily identified with it. We don't have to claim it or possess it.
I think it's a relief to know that you're more than your thinking and feeling. It's like I have this whole other capacity to watch my thoughts and feelings that's really kind of untouched by these feelings. And it's not overwhelmed by them. It doesn't have to suppress them. It can simply watch them. And that's a very empowering thing for somebody to learn.
A woman I've worked with for a while, if she had a thought about how horrible she was, then she must be horrible. She's aware of this constant barrage of self-criticism. And one day, she suddenly realized that this was just thinking, and she started to laugh. In that moment, she disidentified from that thought stream, from that narrative. It was no longer defining her. It was just, look at that. There's an interesting thought stream, and I'm going to sing it. And she started singing these self-judgmental thoughts to the tune of 76 trombones. And it wasn't who I am. It was this thing. And she was free. In that moment, she was free.
Relating to thoughts in this way can be especially helpful for those facing serious mental distress.
For people that have never been introduced to the idea that they are not the voice in their head, and that they could actually take a break from that for a second, just by redirecting attention. I think to begin to play with that in the beginning, particularly with people that are highly traumatized and have been suffering a lot, you do get some insights, you know, pretty quickly. It's like, oh, wow. You know, like, it's almost like I feel better and I don't know why.
Yeah, it's really the moment that we recognize that thoughts are just thoughts and that they come and they go and they change is incredibly liberating. That is really the key to psychological freedom.
We're no longer, subject to the tyranny of our own minds. My favorite quotes from one of the children said, "Mindfulness is not letting thoughts get in the way of living your life." Wisdom from a 12-year-old.
Probably 50% of mental health really boils down to one thing. The experience and the intellectual understanding and the felt recognition again and again and again that I have my problem, but I am not my problem. I think, to paraphrase, I believe, Maya Angelou, she says, I am certainly affected by the challenges I've faced in life, but I refuse to be defined by them.